Have you ever felt overlooked or dismissed based on how you looked? Imagine being ignored, even disrespected, by those meant to serve you. In today's story, we follow John, an ordinary passenger, or so the airline crew thinks. When he boards the plane, he's met with cold indifference, outright disdain, and even public humiliation, simply because he doesn't look the part. But what this crew doesn't know is that John is no ordinary traveler. He's the CEO of the airline, and he's about to show them that every passenger deserves respect, regardless of appearances. Stick around to see how he turns the tables on them in a story about justice, dignity, and redemption. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Let us know your thoughts on what true respect should look like. John settled into his seat in economy class, subtly adjusting the brim of his faded baseball cap. He had deliberately chosen the simplest attire: jeans, an old hoodie, and a pair of worn sneakers to blend in with the crowd. "Here we go," he murmured, feeling a mix of excitement and curiosity. As passengers continued boarding, John observed the cabin crew. Linda, a strikingly poised flight attendant with sharp, scrutinizing eyes, glanced in his direction. Her lips pressed together as if assessing him and instantly dismissing whatever she saw. "Excuse me, ma'am," John ventured, testing the waters. "Could I get a bottle of water, please?" Linda gave a shallow sigh, her gaze lingering on him for half a beat before turning her attention to a well-dressed man 2 rows up. She flashed the passenger a warm smile, adjusting her tone to something closer to admiration, and greeted him as if welcoming royalty on board. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything to make your flight more comfortable?" she offered. John raised an eyebrow, catching the blatant difference in her demeanor. He kept his cool, noting the interaction, but it only heightened his anticipation. This was exactly why he was here, to experience firsthand how his passengers were treated, without the rose-colored filter his position usually afforded him. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Linda returned to the aisle with the beverage cart. When she reached John's row, he politely reminded her, "Ma'am, could I have that bottle of water, please?" This time, Linda shot him a terse glance. "We're out," she stated bluntly, not even glancing at the cart stocked with drinks just inches away. John bit back his irritation, nodding politely. The experience, he reminded himself, was precisely why he was here. But Linda's dismissive tone, coupled with the indifference in her face, stirred a growing unease in him. A few minutes later, Linda reappeared with a steaming cup of coffee, carefully handing it to the businessman in the front. Their exchange was filled with cordiality. She laughed at his jokes, nodding with a smile that hadn't made an appearance anywhere near John's row. "Is there a chance I could get a coffee as well?" John asked, gesturing subtly towards the cup. Linda looked at him, barely concealing her annoyance, and after a pause, muttered, "Fine." She poured a scalding cup, almost spilling it in her rush, and handed it to him with a quick, almost mocking "here." Before he could respond, she had already turned away. But as he lifted the cup, a jolt shook the plane, and the coffee spilled over the rim, landing squarely on his hand. The hot liquid stung as it seeped through his skin, causing him to wince. "Oh," he exclaimed, his tone a mix of pain and disbelief. He quickly reached for a napkin, dabbing his hand. Linda barely turned. "Maybe hold your cup next time," she quipped without a trace of concern, her eyes already focused elsewhere. John looked down, forcing himself to remain calm. This was a test, after all. Still, he found himself clenching his jaw, silently counting down the minutes until the flight would land. As Linda strode past him again, John decided to push a bit further. "I'd like to speak to the lead attendant, please," he said evenly. Linda let out a short, mirthless laugh. "For what, exactly?" "I'd just like to share some feedback," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, tinged with sarcasm. "Look, we're busy. I've got real passengers to look after. Why don't you just sit tight and let us do our job?" John leaned back, observing her closely. "Right. Thank you. Linda, is it?" He pronounced her name slowly, as if committing it to memory. She nodded with a hint of pride. "That's right," she replied, as if acknowledging her own importance. The interaction left a bitter taste, each moment highlighting Linda's dismissive attitude not just towards him, but to anyone she deemed unworthy of her attention. John made a mental note, his decision crystallizing with every exchange. This flight, it seemed, was going to reveal more than he had anticipated. Before we continue with this powerful story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. That's how you can contribute and help us keep bringing you meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's continue. As minutes ticked by, John's patience wore thin. He noticed other passengers receiving attentive service, especially those dressed in business attire or with a more polished appearance. Each interaction seemed to intensify the cold treatment he was receiving. Despite his usual calm demeanor, a sense of irritation was beginning to surface. John glanced around, spotting Tom, the lead flight attendant, as he guided another passenger to an empty row. Sensing an opportunity, he raised his hand subtly, catching Tom's attention. "Excuse me, Tom, do you have a moment?" John asked, his tone polite but firm. Tom's gaze flickered over him, the briefest look of disdain flashing across his face. "What is it?" he replied, the words clipped and impatient. "Well, I've had a bit of trouble getting service on this flight," John began, keeping his tone measured. "And I wanted to mention that Look, sir," Tom interrupted, not even attempting to hide his annoyance. "We're quite busy here. If you need anything, Linda will attend to you when she has time." "I understand you're busy," John replied, keeping his voice steady, "but I would appreciate just a little attention, maybe a bottle of water." Tom let out a short, exasperated breath. "We don't cater to individual demands like this," he replied with a shrug, dismissing John's request. "If Linda hasn't been able to help, there's probably a reason for it." John raised an eyebrow, noting the dismissive way Tom brushed him off. "A reason?" he echoed, incredulous. Tom leaned in, lowering his voice, his tone carrying an edge of condescension. "Let me put it this way," he whispered, glancing down at John's worn hoodie and sneakers. "We prioritize guests who bring value to our flight. Just sit back and relax. We'll get to you, eventually." Before John could respond, Tom straightened up, his expression hardening. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode down the aisle, leaving John feeling a rare sense of disbelief and anger bubbling within him. A few seats away, an older lady looked on sympathetically. She leaned over, offering a warm smile. "Excuse me, young man," she whispered, her voice gentle. "Would you like some of my water? I have an extra bottle." John managed a grateful smile, shaking his head. "Thank you, ma'am, but I'm all right. I appreciate it." Her kindness momentarily softened his mood, but the disrespectful behavior of the crew was becoming impossible to ignore. He took a deep breath, glancing out the window as the clouds drifted by, contemplating his next move. Moments later, Linda appeared again, this time handing out snack packs. When she reached John's row, she practically tossed the pack onto his tray, avoiding eye contact. "Thank you," John said, his voice calm, though he was beginning to struggle with keeping his composure. Linda gave a perfunctory nod, her expression icy. "Sure." Just as John opened his snack, another attendant, Mike, the co-pilot, walked by, stopping near John's seat. "Sir," he started, looking down at John with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If there's anything you're uncomfortable with, you could have chosen a different airline. We're not responsible for everyone's personal standards, after all." John looked up, his gaze steady. "I see," he replied, his tone neutral. "I assume this is the standard treatment here, then?" Mike's smile widened just a fraction, but his eyes remained cold. "It is for passengers like you." As Mike walked away, John clenched his fists, forcing himself to maintain composure. The dismissive comments, the condescension, they were pushing him to his limits. He mentally reminded himself of the purpose of this trip, to see the truth, to understand his company's culture from the ground up. But nothing had prepared him for this. As the flight continued, John found himself growing more frustrated, not just at the dismissive behavior, but at the clear prejudice he was witnessing. He looked around, noticing that other passengers continued to receive service with polite smiles and courteous greetings. However, anytime Linda or Tom passed by his row, they would either avert their eyes or exchange glances as though he wasn't worth their attention. At one point, Linda approached a passenger seated across the aisle from John, who had been adjusting her seat repeatedly. She leaned in, her tone honeyed and warm. "Is everything comfortable for you, ma'am? Would you like an extra pillow?" "Oh, yes, that would be lovely, thank you," the woman replied with a smile. John couldn't help himself. "Excuse me, Linda," he interjected, his voice steady, but with a hint of firmness. "Could I possibly get a pillow as well?" Linda froze, her smile faltering. She turned, eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at him. "Sir, we're limited on extra pillows. They're for passengers with special needs." John met her gaze, unflinching. "And you determined that I don't have one?" Linda's lips pursed, her expression hardening. "Like I said, they're limited. If you needed extra comfort, perhaps you should have considered upgrading." There was an audible intake of breath from a passenger nearby, but Linda didn't seem fazed. She merely turned on her heel, her posture exuding a certain self-satisfied air, and moved down the aisle. John clenched his jaw, looking at the untouched snack on his tray. The more the crew disregarded him, the more his resolve strengthened. He wasn't just here to see how the staff treated a random passenger. He was here to understand how it felt to be demeaned and ignored by those who were supposed to serve. A few minutes later, Tom passed by again, and John decided to take one last chance to gauge their reaction. "Excuse me, Tom, is there a supervisor on board?" Tom gave him a flat stare. "Why would you need a supervisor?" John's gaze didn't waver. "I think I have a few points of feedback that could help improve your service." Tom's eyes narrowed, his expression both annoyed and slightly amused. "Look, if you have complaints, you can direct them to customer service after the flight. Right now, we're a little too busy to cater to every whim." John nodded slowly. "I see. And are you too busy to ensure that every passenger feels respected and valued?" Tom let out a short laugh, glancing down the aisle as if searching for an escape. "Buddy, we get people like you all the time, thinking you deserve some kind of royal treatment. News flash, you're just another passenger." "Noted," John replied calmly, though his patience was nearing its end. He glanced around, noticing a young flight attendant who looked somewhat nervous, standing at the galley. Her eyes darted toward him, then quickly away, as if she understood what was happening but didn't dare intervene. He caught her gaze briefly, offering a small, knowing nod. But before he could say anything, Linda swooped back down the aisle, her tone abrupt. "Sir, is there anything else you need?" "Actually, yes," John replied, his tone colder than before. "I'd like to know why you seem so hostile to certain passengers. Does the airline teach this level of customer care?" Linda's face flushed. She stammered for a second before regaining her composure. "We're not hostile," she snapped, "but we do have standards. Maybe if you had a bit more awareness of those standards, you wouldn't be so quick to criticize." John raised an eyebrow. "Standards that involve throwing hot coffee at a passenger and neglecting requests?" She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "I'm sorry if you feel that way, but maybe next time, consider how your own attitude comes across." The tension was thick. A few passengers nearby were watching with wide eyes, some whispering among themselves, but Linda seemed unfazed. She shot him one last icy glare before stepping back, leaving John to ponder the blatant lack of accountability in his company's frontline team. John leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment as he took a deep breath, willing himself to remain calm. This flight, which he had initially approached with a certain curiosity, was quickly devolving into an experience he hadn't anticipated. He'd heard stories of poor service and complaints from passengers over the years, but facing it himself with such blatant disregard was something else entirely. As he opened his eyes, he caught sight of Linda further up the aisle, speaking with another flight attendant, a younger woman with her hair pulled back tightly and an anxious look on her face. Linda gestured back toward John, rolling her eyes as if sharing an inside joke. The younger attendant nodded, her gaze flicking over to John briefly before she looked away. Deciding he couldn't simply sit back and watch, John raised his hand, signaling Linda as she made her way back down the aisle. She stopped a few rows away, pretending not to notice him, but John kept his hand raised, unwilling to be ignored this time. "Linda," he called out, keeping his voice steady, though a hint of frustration seeped through. "Could I have a quick word with you?" She turned slowly, her expression exasperated. "What is it now, sir?" John took a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'd just like to know if there's a specific reason why certain passengers seem to be getting preferential treatment while others are being ignored." Her eyes narrowed, a slight smirk playing at her lips. "I'm not sure what you mean. We treat all our passengers according to the airline's standards. Is that so?" John replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Because it seems to me that those standards vary depending on the person's appearance." Linda's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a colder, more guarded expression. "Sir, if you're unsatisfied with the service, you're welcome to take it up with customer support after the flight." "I intend to," John replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I'd also appreciate a straightforward answer. Is it policy to treat passengers differently based on your assumptions about them?" "Look," she said, her tone sharp, "I don't know what kind of experience you're expecting, but maybe if you dressed a bit more appropriately, people might take you more seriously." The comment hit him like a slap. It wasn't just dismissive, it was a clear statement of her perception of him, grounded purely in appearances. John held her gaze, refusing to let her see that the remark had landed. "Thank you for the clarification," he said, his voice icy. "I just wanted to be sure I understood where things stand." Linda rolled her eyes. "Maybe if you stop making demands, you'll find this flight a bit more pleasant." With that, she turned and strode off, her back straight, exuding an air of smug confidence. John watched her go, a strange mixture of frustration and disappointment simmering within him. This was his airline, his company, and yet this was the culture he was witnessing firsthand. Just as he was settling back, determined to ride out the rest of the flight in silence, he noticed the older lady across the aisle again. She leaned over, offering him a sympathetic smile. "Dear, I've never seen anything like it," she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They've been downright rude to you." John gave her a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you for noticing, ma'am. I appreciate the kindness." "It's appalling," she continued, shaking her head. "You seem like a perfectly nice young man. I don't understand why they're acting this way." John allowed himself a soft chuckle. "Let's just say, sometimes it's useful to see things from a different perspective." The lady gave him a puzzled look but nodded, sensing there was more to his statement than met the eye. A few minutes later, Tom returned to the aisle, leaning down to speak to the older gentleman in front of John. He was dressed in a well-tailored suit, with polished shoes and a leather briefcase by his feet. Tom's tone was polite, even deferential, as he offered to adjust the man's seat. "Anything I can get you, sir?" Tom asked, his voice warm and accommodating. The gentleman shook his head, smiling. "No, thank you, Tom. I'm quite comfortable." Tom lingered for a moment, exchanging a few pleasant words before turning back and locking eyes with John. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a look of thinly veiled irritation. "Sir," he said curtly, "is there something you need?" John met his gaze, sensing the challenge in Tom's tone. "Just curious if I could receive even a fraction of the courtesy shown to some of the other passengers here." Tom's lip curled slightly. "Courtesy is earned," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it's usually given to those who know how to act." The disdain was evident, a thinly veiled jab. John's hands clenched involuntarily, but he kept his voice calm. "I see. Well, thank you for making your position clear, Tom." Tom straightened, glancing at John with a look that bordered on contempt before he walked away. This was more than just poor service. It was a systemic issue, a mindset that had somehow permeated his company's workforce. John took a deep breath, reminding himself that this experience, unpleasant as it was a valuable insight. It gave him a raw, unfiltered view into the culture his customers faced. As the flight dragged on, John's resolve only solidified. He would endure this, for now, but changes were coming, and they would be swift and uncompromising. John sat quietly, the hum of the plane's engines vibrating beneath his seat. a steady reminder of the journey ahead. He let the conversations and occasional laughter from other rows wash over him, each sound a painful contrast to his own experience. The more he thought about the dismissive treatment he'd endured, the more a question weighed on his mind. How many other passengers had felt this way before? How many people had boarded one of his planes, only to leave with a bitter aftertaste? As he pondered this, Linda came down the aisle, once again offering drinks. She handed a glass of orange juice to the passenger next to him with a smile. When she reached John, she hesitated, her expression growing cold. "Anything for you?" she asked, the question lacking any genuine warmth. "Yes, actually," John replied, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like to understand something, Linda." She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms over her chest. "Go on." He maintained eye contact, his gaze unwavering. "What determines how you decide to treat passengers? Is it based on how they look? Or maybe what they're wearing?" Linda gave a hollow laugh, a hint of annoyance in her eyes. "Sir, I think you're overanalyzing things. We have a job to do, and we try our best to meet everyone's needs. Is that so?" John replied, his tone measured. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like certain passengers are being ignored and outright disrespected, while others are receiving red carpet treatment." Linda's mouth twitched slightly, a hint of defensiveness in her posture. "Look, we have to prioritize. It's nothing personal. If you wanted a more exclusive experience, maybe economy wasn't the best choice." John's eyes narrowed, though his expression remained calm. "Perhaps, but shouldn't respect be standard for all passengers, regardless of where they sit?" Linda's gaze hardened, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Look, sir, if you have complaints, take them up after the flight. Right now, we're busy trying to keep this cabin running smoothly." She made a dismissive gesture, signaling the end of the conversation. John watched her, noting the way she brushed off his words as if they were beneath her. After she walked away, John's thoughts shifted. He didn't want to cause a scene, but it was becoming clear that he needed to make an example of this flight. However, he was determined to give Linda and the rest of the crew one last opportunity to correct their behavior. He leaned forward, pressing the call button. Within moments, Tom appeared, his expression bored and unenthusiastic. "Sir, is there an emergency?" Tom asked, barely masking his irritation. "Actually, there is," John replied, his tone steady. "It's an emergency of respect, or the lack thereof." Tom's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by John's words. He quickly recovered, adopting a smug smile. "Sir, I'm afraid we don't cater to personal grievances." John tilted his head, observing Tom closely. "Is that the official company stance? That personal grievances regarding customer service don't matter?" Tom shrugged. "Our job is to get you from point A to point B safely. Everything else is secondary." John nodded slowly, absorbing the man's words. "I see. Well, that's an interesting perspective, Tom. I just hope it aligns with the company's values." Tom's smile faltered slightly, as if sensing something off about John's calm demeanor. "Look, if you want 5-star service, maybe next time choose first class. Otherwise, we're done here." With that, Tom turned on his heel, clearly dismissing John's concerns. As the minutes stretched on, John's patience dwindled further. He glanced around, noting that several passengers were now watching him curiously, having caught snippets of his exchanges with the crew. The older lady across the aisle gave him a supportive nod, mouthing, "Good for you," as if encouraging him to stand his ground. Just as he was about to settle back, a young attendant he hadn't seen before approached him. She looked nervous, casting quick glances over her shoulder as if worried she might be reprimanded. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered, her tone tentative. "I'm sorry about how you've been treated. It's not supposed to be like this." John looked at her, surprised by the unexpected show of empathy. "Thank you. I appreciate that," he replied softly. "What's your name?" "Rebecca," she replied, glancing over her shoulder again. I wanted to let you know that not all of us think this way." John nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Rebecca. I hope you know that your kindness is noticed." Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she gave him a small nod before scurrying back to the galley. John watched her go, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. There were good people in his company, people like Rebecca who genuinely cared. It was up to him to ensure that they had an environment where kindness, not contempt, was the standard. A short while later, Mike, the co-pilot, came by, pausing at John's row with a look of mild irritation. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his tone icy. John looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "No problem at all. I just hope you're all aware that the way passengers are treated reflects on the airline as a whole." Mike's jaw tightened slightly. "We're aware, sir, and we handle things as we see fit." "Interesting," John replied, his tone calm but with an unmistakable edge. "I'm sure that perspective will be enlightening during the next company review." Mike narrowed his eyes, his posture stiffening. "And who exactly do you think you are to judge us?" John leaned back, his gaze steady. "Just someone who believes in a standard of respect and dignity. A standard that should be upheld, regardless of someone's attire or seating choice." Mike gave a low scoff, shaking his head. "Well, in my experience, people who make a fuss in economy tend to be..." He paused, glancing at John's casual attire. "Less credible." John's gaze didn't waver. "And people who judge by appearances often find themselves mistaken." Mike straightened up, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. John's hands clenched on his tray, a quiet fire simmering within him. This was no longer just an uncomfortable experience. It was a call to action. The rest of the flight passed slowly, punctuated by occasional, cold glances from the crew. John endured it all silently, each moment adding to his growing determination. When the plane finally touched down, he remained seated, allowing the other passengers to disembark first. As they filed out, several nodded in his direction, offering quiet support. Once the last passenger had exited, John stood up, taking his time as he gathered his belongings. Tom, Linda, and Mike watched him from a distance, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. John approached them, a calm smile on his face as he extended his hand. "Thank you for the flight," he said, his tone even. Linda eyed him warily, but accepted his handshake. "Safe travels, sir," she replied, though her voice carried a note of mockery. John met each of their gazes, lingering on each face. "Oh, don't worry. You'll be seeing me again soon. And next time, I assure you, the circumstances will be different." The three exchanged puzzled looks, their confident expressions beginning to falter as a hint of doubt crept in. Without another word, John turned and strode off the plane, his decision made. Changes were coming, and they would be swift and unyielding. John exited the plane with a calm demeanor, but inside, his mind raced. He took a moment to stand by the gate, watching the other passengers disperse into the terminal. A few shot him supportive glances, others patted him on the shoulder in passing. His experience on this flight had left a lasting impression, not just on him, but on everyone who had witnessed the treatment he endured. He knew that addressing this issue was no longer just a matter of professional duty. It was personal. As he made his way to the baggage claim, John dialed a number on his phone, waiting as it rang. After a moment, a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Margaret speaking," came the professional but warm voice of his executive assistant. "Margaret, it's John. I'm back," he said, his tone even but charged with a sense of purpose. "Mr. Edwards, welcome back, sir. How was the flight?" she asked, but there was a pause on the other end as if she could sense something was off. "It was enlightening, to say the least," John replied, a hint of steel in his voice. "Let's schedule a meeting with the board. I want a full review of our customer service protocols and training by the end of the week." Margaret paused, clearly noting the seriousness in his tone. "Understood, sir. Would you like the department heads present as well?" "Yes," John affirmed. "But first, I'll need to have a word with HR. There's going to be some restructuring, starting immediately." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then replied with quiet understanding. "Consider it done, Mr. Edwards. I'll start making arrangements." After hanging up, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. His recent experience had shown him just how detached some employees had become from the airline's core values, values he had built from the ground up. There had been a time when he personally led the customer service training sessions, sharing his vision of respect and dignity for every passenger. Somewhere along the way, however, those values had faded, lost among the demands of rapid expansion and management delegation. As he arrived at baggage claim, John spotted Tom, Linda, and Mike gathered near the exit, exchanging whispers as they awaited their own rides. They looked up when they noticed him approaching, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and faint apprehension. Without breaking his stride, John approached them, offering a polite but tight-lipped smile. "Good to see you again," he said, his tone calm, though a hint of something more lay beneath the surface. Linda's smile faltered. "Oh, hello again, sir. Everything all right?" John gave a slight nod, keeping his gaze steady. "I wanted to thank you for an informative experience. It's rare I get to see things from this angle." Tom shifted uncomfortably, his usual confident posture diminishing slightly. "Sir, if there was any misunderstanding during the flight, we assure you, it's nothing personal." "Nothing personal," John repeated, a slight edge in his voice. "And yet, I couldn't help but notice that personal biases seemed to play a rather large role in how I, and several other passengers, were treated." Mike cleared his throat, trying to adopt a more formal tone. "Sir, our priority is safety and comfort for all passengers. If anything was less than satisfactory, we apologize, but—" John held up a hand, silencing him. "I understand, Mike, and I'm sure you're doing what you believe is best. But I think it's important to remember that comfort and respect are not reserved solely for those in first class or those who look the part." Linda, visibly nervous, tried to cover her discomfort with a stiff smile. "We understand, sir. Thank you for the feedback." John's gaze shifted between them, his calm expression betraying nothing of his frustration. "I hope so," he said, his tone almost too polite, "because soon you'll have a new set of standards to follow. Ones that will leave no room for selective service." They exchanged wary glances, unsure of what he meant. John simply gave them a nod, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking away. He knew that words alone wouldn't change ingrained attitudes, but he was prepared to back his words with action. The following day, John sat at the head of the conference table, waiting as the department heads and HR representatives filed into the room. The air was thick with anticipation. The team could sense that something significant was about to be addressed. Margaret sat to his right, her notebook open, ready to take notes. Once everyone had settled, John began, his voice steady but authoritative. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. I've recently returned from a flight, and let's just say the experience was not up to the standards I expect from our airline." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, watching as the department heads exchanged uneasy glances. "I'll be direct," he continued. "We have an issue with our company culture. There is a disturbing lack of respect and accountability among some of our frontline staff, and this is not something I'm willing to tolerate." A hand went up from across the table. Renee, the head of customer service. "Sir, could you elaborate? What specific issues did you observe?" John nodded, appreciating her directness. "I observed crew members dismissing passengers based on appearances, neglecting requests, and even going as far as to mock certain passengers they deemed unimportant." The room fell silent, his words landing heavily. "This is not the airline I built," John stated, his voice growing firmer. "We're supposed to be setting an example for other airlines, treating every passenger, regardless of who they are or what they look like, with respect and courtesy. That's what we once prided ourselves on, and that's what we're going to get back to." HR Director, Claire, leaned forward, nodding in agreement. "I think this might be a symptom of rapid growth. As we've expanded, certain standards may have been diluted." John's gaze was sharp. "Perhaps, but that doesn't excuse what I witnessed. From this point forward, we will implement a new customer service training program, one that I will oversee personally." The heads nodded, absorbing his words. "And let's be clear," John continued, his tone colder now. "Any employee found to be engaging in discriminatory or dismissive behavior will face consequences. This is not negotiable. We're going to set an example, starting from the ground up." Renee, visibly relieved, gave a firm nod. "Understood, sir. I'll begin reviewing our current training modules immediately." Good, John replied. And one last thing, effective immediately, we'll be conducting undercover passenger assessments on random flights. I want to see firsthand if the service we claim to offer is actually what we're providing. There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Margaret made a note, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. She had seen John build this airline from scratch, and she knew how much he valued the integrity of the company's reputation. Thank you all, John concluded, standing up. Let's work together to make this airline what it was always meant to be. A place where every passenger, regardless of their background or attire, feels respected. As he left the conference room, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had been reminded of his roots, of why he had started this airline in the first place, and he was ready to make the necessary changes, no matter the resistance he might face. That evening, as he walked through the terminal of his airline's main hub, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He knew there was work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity about the future. It was a future built not just on growth and profits, but on a commitment to treating every individual with the dignity they deserved. The following week, John walked into the training facility, his presence unannounced. He was here not as a CEO in a suit, but as a man with a mission, wearing casual attire to match the trainees and blend in. The space buzzed with the voices of new recruits and experienced crew members alike, gathered for what they believed to be a routine update. As John scanned the room, he spotted Linda and Tom, seated toward the back. They hadn't noticed him yet, their attention focused on their phones, scrolling absent-mindedly. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that this was about more than just a few individuals. It was about restoring the integrity of the entire team. Margaret stepped to the front, tapping the microphone gently to gain the crowd's attention. The voices quieted, and heads turned her way. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her tone calm but firm. "Thank you all for being here today. We have a new training module to go through, one that will be implemented across all flights and all customer service touchpoints." There was a murmur among the crowd, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "This training," Margaret continued, "will be overseen by Mr. Edwards himself." Linda's head snapped up, her eyes widening as she scanned the room. She finally spotted John, who stood at the side, arms crossed, watching the room with a measured expression. Linda nudged Tom, whispering urgently, and his face paled as he looked in John's direction. John stepped forward, moving to the front of the room. He took the microphone from Margaret, nodding his thanks, and then addressed the room, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I won't take up too much of your time, but I want to be clear about the purpose of this new training module. Our goal here isn't just to check a box or fulfill a requirement. This is about reestablishing what this company stands for: respect, dignity, and accountability." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Recently," he continued, "I had the opportunity to experience our airline service from a different perspective. And frankly, it was an experience that left me concerned." The crowd shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. "Too often, I witnessed certain passengers being dismissed or even mocked," he said, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "And I want to make it clear, that behavior has no place here." Tom and Linda exchanged a look, their postures tense. John noticed their reaction, noting the subtle discomfort that flickered across their faces. "To make sure we're all aligned on what's expected, I'll be sitting in on today's session," John continued. "This isn't about singling anyone out or pointing fingers. It's about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their appearance or their seat number, receives the same level of respect." He looked out over the room, noting the mixture of expressions, some nodding in agreement, others looking visibly uneasy. "Any questions before we begin?" he asked, his gaze settling on Tom, who seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of John's attention. After a moment, a young trainee raised her hand. "Sir, will this training involve new protocols for how we handle difficult passengers?" John nodded, appreciating her directness. "Yes, and it will also cover how to address any unconscious biases that might affect our judgment. We want every team member to be aware of how even small actions can impact a passenger's experience." Linda raised her hand slowly, her expression a mix of defiance and unease. With all due respect, Mr. Edwards, not all passengers are reasonable. Some come with attitudes that make it impossible to treat them like everyone else. John met her gaze, his expression impassive. Linda, I understand that passengers can sometimes be challenging, but it's precisely in those moments that our professionalism is tested. Our goal is not to react to others' behavior, but to uphold our standards, regardless of the situation. She looked away, her jaw tightening, but John could see a flicker of realization behind her defiance. It was clear she was beginning to understand the gravity of the change he was implementing. The training session began, led by a facilitator who delved into the core principles of respect, empathy, and patience. John observed closely, his attention fixed on the responses of his team. He noticed some crew members nodding in agreement, while others, like Tom, seemed resistant, their expressions closed off. As the session continued, John found himself drawn into a role-playing exercise with another trainee. The scenario involved handling a frustrated passenger who had been overlooked during meal service. The trainee, a young woman named Sarah, approached him with a warm smile, her demeanor calm and reassuring. "Good evening, sir. I noticed you didn't receive your meal earlier. I apologize for the oversight," she said, her voice steady and empathetic. "Is there anything I can bring you now?" John played along, his tone slightly irritated. "I've been sitting here waiting, watching everyone else get served. Why did I get ignored?" Sarah maintained her composure, her eyes reflecting understanding. "I'm truly sorry, sir. It wasn't intentional, and I want to make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight. Please allow me to bring your meal right away, and if there's anything else you need, just let me know." As the exercise concluded, John smiled, impressed. "Well done, Sarah. That's exactly the approach we're aiming for." A few others applauded, but he noticed Linda crossing her arms, her expression skeptical. When the session ended, John approached her. "Linda, do you have any thoughts on what we covered today?" She looked at him, hesitating. "Honestly, Mr. Edwards, some of this feels idealistic. In the real world, not all passengers respond to kindness." John nodded, acknowledging her perspective. "You're right, Linda. But this isn't about getting the perfect reaction from every passenger. It's about ensuring that we hold ourselves to a standard, regardless of how others behave." She shifted, clearly wrestling with his words. "I understand, sir. I'll try." John offered a small, encouraging smile. "That's all I ask, Linda. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with effort, and that's enough for now." As the team dispersed, John felt a renewed sense of hope. While he knew there would be resistance, he could already see the beginnings of a shift in attitude, and that was a victory worth building on. After a few weeks of intense retraining, John's expectations began to materialize in small but noticeable ways. He made a point of personally joining random flights as an observer, evaluating the crew's progress in real time. Some, like Sarah, were quick to adapt, welcoming the new standards and embracing the challenge. Others, like Tom and Linda, still grappled with the shift, often reverting to old habits when under stress. On one particularly busy afternoon, John boarded a flight that Linda and Tom were scheduled to serve. He chose a seat in the middle row, blending in with the other passengers. From his vantage point, he could see Linda moving through the cabin, greeting passengers with a forced smile that barely concealed her lingering resentment. Tom, on the other hand, avoided eye contact with the passengers altogether, completing his tasks with a hurried indifference. As Linda approached a young mother struggling to settle her toddler into the seat, John listened carefully, noticing the subtle tension in her voice. "Ma'am, if you could just keep your child still," Linda said, her voice strained, though she attempted to mask her frustration. "We have a lot of people boarding, and we need the aisles clear." The mother, clearly embarrassed, mumbled an apology and tried to soothe her child. Linda moved on, her smile disappearing as soon as she turned her back. A few rows down, John saw Sarah. She knelt beside an elderly couple, her face open and attentive as she helped them find space for their carry-on bags. Her tone was calm, her movements patient, reflecting the empathy John had hoped to instill in every crew member. "Thank you so much, dear," the elderly woman said, patting Sarah's arm appreciatively. Sarah smiled warmly. "It's my pleasure. If there's anything else you need, just press the call button, and I'll be right here." As Sarah moved on, John noticed Linda watching her with a hint of irritation, clearly unenthusiastic about the shift in expectations. Taking this as an opportunity, John decided to observe Linda's response to the demands of the new policies. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Linda noticed John sitting in the middle row and quickly masked her surprise, approaching him with a strained smile. "Mr. Edwards," she greeted him, her voice a mixture of politeness and unease. "I didn't realize you'd be on this flight." John gave her a cordial nod. "Yes, I thought it was time to check in on things. It's always interesting to see how we're progressing." Linda gave a tight smile, clearly uncomfortable. "I hope everything is satisfactory, sir." John tilted his head slightly. "I'm noticing improvements. Sarah, for instance, seems to have fully embraced our new standards. I can see that it makes a difference with the passengers." Linda's expression flickered with a touch of resentment. "With all due respect, sir, some of us have been in this business for years. It's not always so simple to change our ways." John's gaze remained steady. "Change isn't easy, Linda, but sometimes it's necessary. I'd like to see the same dedication in you that I see in Sarah. This isn't about me. It's about every passenger who boards one of our flights." Linda pursed her lips, casting a quick glance around the cabin as if to ensure no one else was listening. "It's just that some people expect too much. They think they're entitled to royal treatment." "Everyone deserves respect, Linda," John replied, his tone calm but unyielding. "It's not about entitlement, it's about decency. And if that's too much to ask, then maybe this isn't the right fit." Linda's cheeks flushed, and for a moment, her eyes dropped. "I understand, Mr. Edwards. I'll work on it." John gave her a brief nod, letting her absorb his words. He could see the resistance waning, the dawning realization of the weight behind his expectations. Later in the flight, John noticed a commotion toward the back of the plane. Tom was speaking with an irritated passenger, his arms crossed over his chest in a stance that was anything but accommodating. "Sir, I've told you, there's nothing we can do about your seat right now," Tom said, his voice edged with frustration. The passenger, an elderly man with a cane, looked up at Tom, his expression weary. "I understand, young man, but I just need a bit more legroom. My knee. It's painful to keep it bent." John moved closer, assessing the situation. Tom glanced at him, his face momentarily flashing with surprise before his features settled into a defensive frown. "Is there a problem here?" John asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Tom shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Edwards, this gentleman here is asking for a seat adjustment, but all our extra legroom seats are taken." John looked at the elderly man, his gaze softening. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. Let me see what we can do to make you more comfortable." The man's face brightened. "Thank you, son. I'd be so grateful." Without missing a beat, John signaled Sarah, who had been assisting another passenger nearby. She quickly approached, her expression attentive. "Sarah, could we find this gentleman a more comfortable arrangement? Perhaps near the emergency exit for additional legroom?" John suggested. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. Sir, please follow me, and we'll get you settled." As she led the man to a new seat, John turned to Tom, his expression firm. "Tom, this is what I'm talking about. I expect every member of our crew to go above and beyond to ensure our passengers' comfort. There's always a solution if you're willing to look for it." Tom looked away, his jaw tight. "Understood, sir." As the flight continued, John noticed more of these moments. Small instances where Sarah shone and Tom struggled, where Linda forced herself to engage but lacked genuine warmth. It was clear that the transition wouldn't be smooth for everyone, but John felt reassured. With time, the culture of the company could change. When the plane finally landed, John waited until most of the passengers had disembarked before approaching Tom and Linda, who were tidying up the cabin. "I want you both to know," John began, his tone sincere, "that this isn't just a test. This is the future of our airline. The expectations are high, but that's because we're here to make a difference. And if you're willing to rise to the occasion, you have my full support." Linda looked down, nodding slowly. Tom, though hesitant, finally met John's gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards." "I'll do my best," he said, his tone quieter than before. "That's all I ask," John replied, offering a small smile. As he exited the plane, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road to change would be difficult, but seeing even the slightest shifts in Linda and Tom's attitudes gave him hope. This was more than a policy change. It was a transformation, one passenger and one crew member at a time. When John finally reveals his true identity, it's a moment that not only shocks the crew but holds up a mirror to the behavior they thought they could get away with. Watching John quietly endure that treatment and then act with grace and integrity reminds us that the most powerful change comes from those willing to hold others accountable without anger or judgment. John shows us that respect is about empathy, about seeing people not by their appearance or social status, but by their humanity. This story is a reminder that every one of us can make a difference in how others are treated, simply by setting the standard ourselves. In a world that often prioritizes profit over people, John's actions teach us that real leadership is about the way we treat others, especially when no one else is watching. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this story and believe in the power of kindness and accountability, don't forget to subscribe and share your own experiences of respect and dignity in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.